Well, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Jim Moran. I'm Senior Advisor at the EU Asia Center here in Brussels. And we're very lucky today. We've got a session of around 45 minutes with Walter Lohman, Director of the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation in the United States. And we're going to be talking about scenarios going forward after the US election as to US policy on Asia, and in particular, of course, with a European angle to it, if we can get into some of the issues there where we can work together or not, depending on who wins the election, and what the main issues are going to be. I think we're going to be talking about China, obviously, a great deal, but I hope it won't be only about China, and that we can also touch on a few other issues, DPRK, of course, the role of ASEAN in all of this, and perhaps a word on India, but we haven't got much time, and we've got a huge amount of territory to cover, given the title of this webinar. But I'm sure that Walter is going to lead us in there and navigate us through it. And let me turn it over to him to make his introduction, and then we'll have 20, 30 minutes for some Q&A. So Walter, thanks again for joining us, and over to you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's nice to meet you. We haven't met before, and I'm glad to be here. I mean, you summarized basically the challenge of every time you try to talk about Asia policy. Is Asia is a damn big place. So, you know, you try to hit the highlights here and focus on what may be most salient. What I want to do is talk about first where Trump is and where things might be going in a Trump presidency, where Biden is, and then just talk separately for a moment about trade policy. And I'm going to try to do that in just about 10 minutes. So don't panic. I'm not going to talk your ear off here at the outset. I really like to get into some discussion over all of these issues, even beyond what I talk about. I want to be responsive to what's on the mind of all the attendees. First on Trump, I'm going to start out with what might sound like an unconventional view of his policy, especially in Europe, because I've engaged friends there on this for the last 4 years, and I know some of the feelings about what's going on. But I think that there's actually been more continuity in Trump's policy toward Asia than difference from what came before him. You know, there's obviously a difference in style. It's sometimes unsettling to see the tweets and all the rest. But if you look at what's really happened on the ground on US policy in Asia, in the Indo-Pacific, you've had more continuity than change. First, alliances. Our alliances are in better shape than sometimes portrayed, or sometimes the feelings might be. Very early on, the administration sought to reassure allies in Asia, Japan, and South Korea, principal among them. We went through some rough patch with Australia early on, but I think that's in good shape now. And then we've got some allies in Southeast Asia, which are a special case. Maybe we can talk about in Q&A a little bit, but generally alliances are strong. Our military continues to be forward deployed. There's no speculation really of some sort of broad American pullout. I mean, the things that were undertaken during the Obama administration to redistribute or rebalance forces to a sort of weighted advantage of the Pacific has been maintained. You know, we continue some efforts there, like the build out on Guam and the changing footprint of our forces in Japan. There's really no sudden moves when it comes to alliances and foreign deployed forces. Diplomatic activity has continued. Now, you know, the substance of it, especially the rhetoric around it, might be different, but you still got secretaries of state going out there, secretaries of defense. We're still highly engaged especially among our allies in Northeast Asia, but also in ASEAN and in the South Pacific. The South Pacific is an interesting thing we could also maybe get into a little bit in the Q&A, and maybe of particular interest to Europe, given the French presence there. And then in a couple areas, like defense budgets in Taiwan, there's been improvements in US policy. So not just marking time there, but improving things. I mean, you know, the US in large part is a power in Asia and the Pacific because it has a major military presence, and the Trump administration has doubled down on military budgets in the last 4 years, looking for increases each time, increasing shipbuilding and all the rest. And on Taiwan, I mean, honestly, if you look at it objectively, there's not been a better administration on Taiwan issues for 40 years. It's the strongest we've ever had, and yet it's still within the framework of America's One China policy. On China policy, I think you have had somewhat of a break from China, especially on Europe, but I mean, sorry, on rhetoric. But Trump is, you know, the leading edge of where Washington is generally on China. There's some consensus around those issues, and he's just pushing the edge of that, I think. If Trump wins the election, I think you get more of that. It's going to be more of the same. I'm not sure who the personnel will be. There's going to be changes in personnel, but I think you have the same general direction. The second thing I want to talk about was Biden and what we might expect there. Might surprise you as well that here I think there's more continuity than change with the Trump administration. I think the U.S. will maintain its traditional commitment to the region, which Trump continued from the previous. You're still going to have forward deployed forces. You still have strong alliances. On China, like I say, there's a general consensus on China. You're not going to go back to the Obama era of engagement. You know, you'll have some adjustments in it, but I think things are going to stay pretty tough on China. That said, I think there are two camps within the Biden world, let's call it. One is a more hawkish one, and a more dovish one. I don't want to oversimplify it, but you know, just for sake of explanation here, there are these two camps, and the more hawkish camp wants to continue the policies of the Trump administration, and is probably more similar in its outlook to the 2017 strategic blueprint that Trump put out than it is similar to anything that happened during the Obama administration. We have a congressional election underway as well, and I think the outcome of that will have some impact on which one of these factions prevails. I think if Democrats end up controlling the Senate, it will give the administration more room to maneuver on China, and it probably empower the more dovish members of the administration. If the Republicans keep control of the Senate, I think just the opposite. I think that empowers some of the harder line members of the administration. And then on trade, you know, there's a general consensus on trade now in Washington, and unfortunately, from my perspective, it's not a good consensus. The U.S. is turning much more protectionist, much more oriented around industrial policy, and this is a bipartisan turn on this. I think Trump and Biden both reflect those trends. It's impossible for me to imagine really that these two are going to fight their way through the Rust Belt in the United States, in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, and then turn on a dime after the election and start with new trade agreements and all the rest. I think the U.S. is probably out of the free trade agreement business, with some exceptions. U.S. UK, you know, is still a possibility, especially under a Biden administration. But when it comes to the Pacific, I think either way, we're probably out of the free trade agreement business for some time, and that's a problem, because it is really the best mechanism suited for creating an American economic agenda as a part of our strategic approach to the region. We cannot really exercise the influence we need to through a negative trade policy, one that's focused on punishing trade violations and anti-dumping duties and all the rest. But I do see that as the most likely outcome. I don't see either president turning back to the TPP. I think the days when we could finesse these things are over. There was a lot of speculation about that in the last election, 2016, that Trump was just sort of feigning rights so that he could come back to the trade, sort of pro-trade side on this. And I'll be darned, he actually meant it when he said he hated TPP, and he pulled out of it, and it wasn't a fake. I remember the time of the quips that, well, if you could just make it the Trump trade agreement or the Trump trade partnership, he would agree to it. But actually, no, that wasn't the case. And I think where it may have been the case with Clinton, I think she was contemplating such a switch at the, when it mattered. I don't think Biden can make that turn, and so that's going to be a problem for us going forward. That is creating an economic component to our engagement in the region. So as I say, I really would rather respond to questions and create a dialogue here than go through much else. But maybe that gives you a little bit of food for thought, and we can go from there.
Thank you, Walter. Thank you very much. That's a good lead into the discussion. A couple of quick questions on some of the things you said. On the state of alliances, and including, of course, here the alliance with Europe, which has seen better days, it must be said, since the advent of President Trump. And it does seem that that is not going to change if he is re-elected. On the other hand, with Mr. Biden, he's made that something of a centerpiece that he will want to work much more closely with Europe, not least on issues like common cause with economic issues and indeed security issues with China and further afield in Asia. How strong do you think that commitment is likely to be if Biden is elected? Am I right in assuming that we don't see any change in the Trump foreign policy, whether it be on foreign security or whether it be on trade, if Mr. Trump is re-elected?
Yeah, I mean, Biden is certainly more of a traditional Atlanticist than Trump. I mean, Trump's not traditional in any way, right? So I think Biden will make a concerted effort to repair some of these relationships. But I think there are some underlying issues here that are going to have to be reconciled either way. I mean, you can argue with the way that Trump has done it, but the idea that our NATO members can't meet a 2% commitment, and that I think Angela Merkel's latest proposal is that they get there by 2035. I mean, for God's sake, I mean, it's ridiculous. And so I think Trump's on pretty firm ground on that. If, like I say, if maybe his rhetorical approach to it and that of his ambassador in Germany is not the most constructive, he's got a good point. And I think it's be hard for Biden to get away from that. These are also, to the point, these are issues that Obama raised as well. I mean, the 2% commitment comes from the Obama years. Trump's just trying to make it happen. I think we have a unique problem in Europe that we don't have in Asia, and that's our familiarity with one another. I think part of why things are so tough between Trump and Germany is because we have more shared cultural background and that sort of thing, a familiarity that breeds a certain amount of contempt on either side, and I think in Asia there's not that same comfort, and so they're more accepting of Trump's eccentricities, basically, and they focus more on what's really happening. Perfect example is Shinzo Abe. I mean, Shinzo Abe, before Trump even took office, before he's inaugurated, knew what he had to do. He swallowed his pride, not even any indication that was a factor for him. And he got on a plane, he went to New York, and he sat down and did what he had to do with Trump. And Abe has done that better than anyone in the world. He's handled Donald Trump better than anyone in the world. And Donald Trump has said more over the last 30 years negative about Japan than he has any country in the world. And yet 4 years later, here we are, we're still in Japan. We still have the 7th Fleet there. We worked out a trade agreement to get over some of the complaints that Trump has had on that score. And we're expanding the relationship in some way. It's impossible for me to imagine a German politician doing the same thing. Now, maybe that's because of differences in the democracies in some extent. A German president has to respond to the feeling that's sort of coming from the grassroots in a way that Japan does too, but in a different way. But still, it's hard to imagine Europeans interacting the way that Abe has with Trump. So I guess all I'm trying to say is that the situation in Asia is different. That leadership dynamic, I think, is similar throughout the region. Same with Moon Jae-in. Moon Jae-in is a leftist par excellence, but Trump has been able to deal with him, and he's been able to deal with Trump. You look at some of the other leaders in the region, you get the same sort of thing where they just accept what's going on in the United States. They're focusing on what really happens on the ground, and they just kind of blow off some of these other disturbances.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. One of the questions coming in here is still on alliances there, relating to what you just said. Mr. Trump has been pretty tough, apart from NATO, where, by the way, there's quite a bit of support for the position that the US has been taking, as you said, ever since the Obama years, on the 2%. But when it comes to Japan and South Korea, there is this statement that the president made that he expects them to raise a large amount of money to pay for US troops who are stationed in Japan and South Korea. And that has caused... Is he going to follow through on that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you raised that because, yeah, you're right. That continues to be a sticking point. It's especially in Korea, and Korea is, from the Japanese perspective, the harbinger of what might await them because their agreement is due up middle of next year as well. And the approach that the U.S. has taken on those negotiations has not been the most constructive. At one point we're demanding 4 times the increase, sort of almost beyond what it takes to maintain the troops there. So that is a problem. But even there, I think the leadership, the political leadership, have attempted to keep it as quiet as they can, to negotiate it behind closed doors and get to some sort of solution. I think in the end, there's going to be an increase, but that increase is going to be an increase in the contribution from the Korean side, especially. That increase is going to be in the range of 10 to 25%, and it's not going to be 400%. But I think you're also going to have that a little bit with Biden as well. I mean, Biden will get to yes a little bit easier, but I think the South Koreans are going to have to give us some face on that as well, and help us get to an agreement. With the Japanese, we got to look at these relationships, I think, more holistically in terms of the contributions that they make. I mean, the Japanese are largely funding the build out on Guam partly because it was for their insistence that we restructure our presence in Okinawa, that we're building out on Guam. And so, but they're paying for that. It's similar with South Korea and the amount of local costs that they cover. So we got to look at it holistically in the fact that we're allies in this. We're not, the U.S. is not mercenary forces in Japan or South Korea. We're in this together. We just need an equitable sharing of cost, and that's why we negotiate it every 5 years, so that we can adjust for circumstances. But I'm glad you raised that, because that is probably the most contentious issue in both of those alliances today.
Well, from what you say, it doesn't look to be terribly promising if Mr. Trump is re-elected as regards any cooperation with Europe over and above what we currently do and have. And as you say, there are many, many levels to that. Business, investment, and trade, we all know will continue regardless of who's president. And let's say the cultural affinity will always be what it is. But in terms of prospects for better cooperation under Trump, it looks to me, from what you're saying and from what I'm hearing elsewhere too, that we can't expect much when it comes to Asia. More of the same seems to be the way. Maybe
I don't know. I'm not trying to say that. I'm sorry if I gave that impression. First of all, I'm not a European specialist, so I'm just offering my layman's opinion on that. But I think that I think you really have to look at what's happening. with U.S. commitment, less so than the rhetoric. And I just find in Europe, and I've been talking for 5 years to friends there, going, giving speeches and all the rest, and I find, especially with the Germans, that they are incapable of separating the two. They're incapable of separating Trump and the rhetoric that comes from there and what we're actually doing in the region. And I think it's similar in Asia, but Europeans see it that way, sort of like you just outlined that. Well, it's we got these sort of dreadful prospects in Asia, but it's not true, because in Asia the leadership isn't as critical of Trump. I mean, in India, you got, the Indians love Trump. The government is very much pro-Trump. In Japan, they do what they have to, and they're not really focused on the big rhetorical issues. They're focused on the presence of the Seventh Fleet. They're focused on joint operations. They're focused on getting to some sort of accommodation on the trade issues. And they're just not worried about the big political dynamic.
And certainly that applies to Taiwan as well, which of course has been extremely happy, I think, to see the renewed commitment to them under the Trump administration.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree.
But then turning to Biden, where things could be different, and looking at particular areas of cooperation with Europe, do you see anything there? I mean, okay, fine, at the multilateral level, he's put that at the center of his foreign policy agenda. The article he did with Foreign Affairs a few months ago brings that out pretty well. But when it comes to working together on some of the issues with China on trade, technology, climate particularly, do you think that there will be a big change there if Biden is elected? And not just with China, perhaps further afield.
Right. No, I think Biden, just like Obama, has an entirely different mindset on multilateral cooperation, climate change, all of these things, that's closer to the way that Europeans see the issues and the way that Europeans want to work together. So, I mean, I think, that's going to facilitate a different tenor in the relationship. There's no question about that. I think that he will also look for cooperation on China, much like the Trump administration has. I think you're still going to find a big push on the U.S. side on some of the tech issues like 5G and other things. And I don't think there's any going back to the period where we were a little bit, on both sides, we were a little bit blind to what the threats were there. I think that continues. I think that he looks for cooperation in the WTO. But then again, there's another thing that is somewhat overlooked and what the Trump administration has actually done. They are trying to work with the EU on some of these WTO reform issues, especially as regards China. Maybe the overall improvement in the tenor of the relationship will help those things. I think that's possible. But I think that both sides here, that is Republican and Democrats, see the value in U.S.-Europe relations as regards Asia. I mean, I think there's a dawning realization that the China challenge is just really too big. It's really too big for us, and it's hard for Americans to admit that. I mean, we stormed through the Pacific in 1941 through 1945, and anybody steeped in that tradition is proud of it and knows why we are there and how we got there, and that you take care of all this. But the China challenge has just gotten so big that we need sort of an all hands on deck type of operation. We need the Europeans with us. And I think both sides recognize that in spades nowadays.
And still on Biden, what about this idea that he has to organize a grand conference of democracies, which of course will include Asians, a number of Asians within it? Do you see that as being significant in any way? I mean, in terms of bringing people together around common cause, and of course, it will. China once again.
Yeah. I don't know. It might be just sort of the Washingtonian in me, but I just think that the more effective things you do in smaller groups, and then you push those things into the bigger policy environment. A grand coalition of democracies, I mean, just hard to imagine that doing much good. We've had a lot of those actually over the last 20 years, and you could debate how useful they've actually been. They make an important sort of philosophical point and ideological point. But we've got some differences that are hard to reconcile. So, I very much agree in some of the processes we have underway to coordinate with the Europeans on China policy, but those are small, quiet efforts that go on. And the upside of our affinity for one another is that we do them so easily. We don't actually need grand conferences. We don't even need small conferences to work with the Germans and the French and the Brits on things with regard to China. We just pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, let's get together and talk about this, and we work out deals, but I think that's where progress is most likely, is in small groups deciding that we're going to push certain agendas and then taking those into ever larger forums.
Yeah, but that hasn't been too easy the last 2 or 3 years dealing with the current US administration. It's been very difficult, even in the country I know best, in the UK. And those who would normally be sympathetic to, let's say, a Republican administration, they found it rather difficult to deal with this administration, not least when it comes to finding calls on free trade and the rest. And as you said, whether it's Mr. Trump or whether it's Mr. Biden, the whole question of free trade agreements looks to be in peril for the next couple of years. Although Mr. Biden has spoken about 1 or 2 times about the TPP, and even if he always couches it by saying that no new trade agreements until we've equipped the US to deal with the global economy. You said earlier you thought that there was very little chance.
Yeah, I just don't.
We're going to stay by that.
I mean, I kind of start from the big trade picture and drive down. And like I say, Trump's trade policy is not really contested by Democrats. I mean, they're contested in sort of from the foreign policy perspective. So you see some Biden people and Democrats saying, well, this isn't the way to treat your allies. And I agree with that. I mean, I don't think aluminum tariffs were the right way to go, or steel tariffs were the right way to go with the Mexicans and the Canadians and the Japanese and the Taiwanese. We have steel tariffs on the Taiwanese. I mean, are they really a security threat? They depend on us for their security. Yeah, I mean, I don't have much hope for where we're headed on the trade agenda generally.
Okay. Oh, well, we'll have to live with that, I guess. There's a point coming in here on India and the Indo-Pacific idea, the Quad, US, Japan, India, Australia. Is that something you think that has got legs going forward?
I do think that has legs. Yeah, I do think that will continue. It gets to this point of the underlying realities that we're dealing with. When we tried this back in the 2000s, 2007, there were some differences from Australia. Basically, Australia tubed it because Kevin Rudd at the time was worried about what the Chinese reaction was, and then so it broke it up, and it embittered the Indians basically for the next 10 years, who were upset that the Australians left them out there on it. But that's not a prospect today. That is, you're not going to have anybody pull out because they're worried about what the Chinese may think, because the sort of pattern of behavior has gotten to be such that we got to do what we got to do, and it's not the most provocative thing in the world, actually. I mean, it's just a meeting of generally assistant secretary level officials, and now secretary levels a couple times, to align perspectives and talk about strategic priorities. There's a lot of headlines out there and editorial opinions about a new NATO of Asia or whatever, which are it's a completely absurd kind of idea generally. But going from where we are on the Quad to a NATO of Asia is just like a jump in, almost a science fiction type of jump in logic. We're not headed to that, but with this modest approach, aligning perspectives and we're going to start to find some, I think, operational synergies here and there on things like maritime awareness, maritime domain awareness, and we're going to be doing the Malabar exercises together. We'll do HADR. We'll find things that we can cooperate on, but I think that kind of modest approach does continue, and that framework will continue into a Biden administration.
Speaking of regional organizations, of course, there has been quite a lot of grumbling in ASEAN, particularly, about the lack of, or presumed lack of interest from the president and some of his close confidants in what they're doing and their situation, rather sort of a blindness to what little regional integration efforts exist in Asia. On the other hand, one would expect perhaps Biden to take a rather more proactive approach, although traveling around Asia at his time of life might prove a little bit challenging for him. What do you think? Would there be greater engagement with ASEAN?
I think there probably will be. Yeah. I think it's important to note, conceptually, the Trump administration has been very supportive of ASEAN. You go through any number of documents, when the head of state from Thailand or Vietnam or whomever head of government in the case of Vietnam visited Washington, they put out statements, all the appropriate references to ASEAN. It's in the national security strategy. The administration has been very careful to not offend ASEAN conceptually. It's an important point of engagement for the United States, and I think they've made that clear. Operationally, it's been a little bit different. I mean, attending meetings and that sort of thing, they've not been the best on that. But in some ways, they're not really that much better than the Bush administration. So it might be reflective more of a general Republican discomfort with multilateral forums. One thing we've never been able to basically get past the ASEANs with, especially Republicans, has been the value of these things. So the ASEAN see very much the process as the product, that you need to be here because we have important meetings, and these meetings themselves are the end. So we're going to have these meetings, and what we accomplish is that we have these meetings again next year, and so you need to come to each one. And just a typical American approach on this is a total waste of time. Why am I going to get on a plane and travel 15 hours to sit in, well, longer than that really, to sit in Jakarta and hear a bunch of pre-recorded speeches? I'll just stay home. So that's a challenge for the Republican side, and I think will continue to be under a Trump administration. But I do think Biden will be more engaged. I hadn't thought about it, because the Obama administration was actually more engaged. That was their involvement in Southeast Asia is probably their best innovation in U.S. Asia policy. But I should have thought of this, but I hadn't thought about the sort of capacity Biden will have to do that at his advanced age. I mean, I hate to say it, but I mean, it's kind of a reality. Is he really going to be able to get on a plane and do this stuff on a regular basis? But Kamala Harris is young, and the ASEANs might make allowance for that.
They may well. And still on the ASEAN side, but now relating it to China and Europe, what about cooperation with ASEAN and the EU, together with the US, of course, on the South China Sea and related issues? It's happening at the moment. You've got, Brits are no longer a member of the EU, but certainly they've made some commitments with the new aircraft carrier once we get the planes sorted out.
Yeah, right.
But the French too, of course, as you mentioned earlier, have strong interests in the region, and others as well. Do you see much prospect for that?
Yeah, I do. I focus a little bit more on the French than the others because the French have the most wherewithal militarily in the region. It's not a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong. I know the limitations of it, but they do have ships permanently stationed in the region, and they contribute those ships on a regular basis to what they would consider freedom of navigation operations. And they dispatch the Charles de Gaulle or whatever from metropolitan France to be involved. And they have done freedom of navigation operations, or again, it's not exactly what we would call freedom of navigation operations, but they have presence operations in South China Sea and in the Taiwan Straits, et cetera. And so, yeah, I think that sort of thing will continue. I think the French will continue to do that in the sort of typical French way, if I could say so, is that they will do it themselves. They'll do it when they want to do it, and they'll tell us about it, and we can talk about it, but coordinating that's going to be imperfect, let's say. I think with the Brits, we have a much more integral military relationship with the Brits, and we're, that has been very useful in the East China Sea, monitoring the sanctions on North Korea, for example. Like you say, like you make reference to their capacity, if, once these aircraft carriers get up and moving, we would expect, and I think from an American perspective, I don't want to say demand, but if we're going to work on this together, then we got to have some skin in the game. And if they've got, we all have to have skin in the game. If the Brits have an aircraft carrier sitting in port, they can't have it both ways. They're going to have to put the aircraft carrier in the South China Sea and work with us there. I mean, from their perspective, maybe they gain a march on the French in the process. I'm always surprised. I'm more of a obviously more of an Asia person than I am a European person, but I'm always amazed by the continuing relevance of French-British rivalry. So if nothing else drives the Brits to get involved in the Pacific, it should be the fact that the French are getting ahead of them.
Well, let's not talk too much about that. We can do another one on that one. But moving up the coastline there of East Asia, maybe a word on North Korea. There are those who argue that the romance between Donald Trump and Mr. Kim has not produced very much up to now. In fact, some are arguing it's acted in a contrary fashion, what with the military parades to go and missiles and the rest of it.
I think. I think it's.
Do the two candidates have a fundamentally different approach on this, do you think?
I mean, I think it's fair to say that, the Trump approach to North Korea has not yielded anything. I mean, just it's obvious on its face. I think, I don't think it's made anything worse. Military parades and celebrations and occasional missile launches are par for the course with North Korea. So, I mean, those things would be going on at any rate. I mean, the Trump administration does hold out the idea that you haven't had any long-range, you've had less threatening long-range missiles. They have tested some rockets, some longer-range rockets, presumably that would deploy satellites, so. I don't know, but bottom line is, I agree. There's no success there. Okay? It's not been a success. There's just no question about that. But I think the problem is, and the problem will be for the Biden administration, is that there's a framework here that is kind of impossible to break through. Right? The Obama administration faced the same problem. The Bush administration before them. It's just almost an insoluble type of a problem. Trump came into office at first thinking he could sort of bully the Koreans into finding the light, and that didn't work. And so then he switched to, trying to encourage them out of their hiding place and try to, get some engagement there. But it's just been the same problem all along. I mean, I think Biden might. I think pretty well can bet on him trying, and creating a new process, something like the framework talks we've had before. And but I don't know. That's probably just more of the same sort of situation. In the meantime, the North Koreans will continue to develop their missile program, nuclear programs. We just got to deal with it long term.
So you wouldn't think that Biden would go a blast from the past here, put a little energy into encouraging the six-party talks, whatever it may be.
Oh no, I think that's possible. Sure. I think that's possible. But that won't really be too much out of spirit of what Trump has done, even at least since the last 3 years. Since he switched from his fire and fury approach, where he's tried to engage them. But no, I think that's possible. I mean, it points to a general disposition, I think, in the Biden camp that they'll look for multilateral or sort of alliance approaches, and that's what the six-party talks did, right? It brought in the Chinese and everybody, Japanese, everybody else involved. So yeah, I think that's very possible.
Yeah. All right, that takes us back to China, and another question comes in: is there no hope at all for working, and here we're talking about a Biden administration, working on with China in the WTO, to go back to the, again, to years ago, when of course people were arguing that one way to tame China is to use their WTO commitments to make them recognize better the rule of law, international rules-based order, all of that sort of thing. Do you think that that is likely to be the case under a Biden administration?
Well, I think the Biden administration will be better disposed to the WTO than Trump. I mean, I think Trump's approach, the Trump administration approach to the WTO, is not as harsh as it sometimes seems. I mean, they are working some issues through it. There was an effort in Washington earlier this year to pull the United States out, using legislative mechanisms to do that. Trump administration shied away from that. So they kind of had an opportunity to push that and they didn't push it. So I think Trump's approach to the WTO, and by that I mean he and his officials, I don't mean his occasional tweet, but I mean it's not as harsh as it sometimes seems or is portrayed. But I do think that Biden will be even more engaged in the WTO and may take will take more cases. And really that's where I see the possible solution to, it's hard to call it a solution, but let's call it an approach to trying to get to a solution, is taking some of these cases like the IPR case to the WTO and not pursuing it unilaterally. And I think that's the way Biden will see it. But I think you do get back to this change in China, and to some extent all of the Trump rhetoric and increased attention to Taiwan and 5G technology and all these other things are a symptom of a problem that's generated in China. It's Xi Jinping's increasing control of the party and in the consolidation of its control over the business sector, primarily. You go back and look at the laws that have been enacted in the last 5 or 6 years and the new procedures within the CCP to make sure they control the economy, and it's proving really hard for the United States to come to grips with, because how can you treat companies that are clearly not private companies like private companies? And I know in Europe they have the same problem. You have these reports coming out from Germany and elsewhere, looking at the same phenomenon. So yeah, I think Biden will use the WTO more, have a more positive disposition to it, but the extent to which we're going to be able to use it to deal with the China challenge is limited.
Yeah. I wouldn't disagree with you, although there is case study, as it were, going way back when there were occasions some years ago when Europe and the US, working together within the WTO, were able to restrain China on some of these issues. Whether the jack is out of the box now, what with the new China that we see dreaming its way into the 21st century, then we'll have to see. I think, Walter, our time is coming to an end, but it's just for me to say thank you so much for finding.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I'm very glad to do it.
Interesting conversation. We've skimmed over the thin ice of a huge part of the world, and we haven't touched a large part of it either. But I think we've got some interesting thoughts. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all. Very glad.
When it comes to the election, as a longtime friend, I studied in the States myself many years ago. In fact, I was there for the '76 election when Jimmy Carter was elected, and I never forget how quickly things changed on a dime. So anyone can, of course, win in a US election, and all I would say is let the best man win.
Yeah, well, that's what we're left with. Absolutely. We'll see what happens. And there's also a congressional election, which is something to keep an eye on too. Part of our political, one of the problems in our political dynamic is too much focus on the one person running for president.
Of course. Time to stop focusing on the personality. Time to get on with the president. Anyway, thanks again. All the best.
Okay.
Have a good one.
Okay, no problem. Take care. Nice to meet you.